Hello guys, welcome back to a Coder Journey. This is the next episode of our implementation of the result pattern in our web API and the Result NuGet package. So in this episode, I have decided to talk about a very useful extension method called map, which has been introduced, in our Result NuGet package, and we're going to see a valid scenario where this map extension method can be helpful. So here we are on a new branch on our solution. End of episode 6. At the end of this episode, I'm going to make a commit to this branch and push the code to the repository. Now back to our node, because we want to talk about this map method and then implement it. So take a look here. In the latest release of our Result, this feature was added, the ability to convert results from one type to another using the map extension method. This is useful when you need to transform the value from within a successful result while preserving the outcome status like success or failure and any associated error messages or validations. One very valid scenario that we can think about when we want to use this extension method is inside of our invoice service. So suppose the invoice service, when it wants to fetch data from the database, uses an invoice entity. But when it wants to get that data to the user, right, return that data to the user, it wants to return an invoice DTO because we do not want to expose our entities to the clients, right? So this mapping, right, this mapping could be handled by this map extension method coming from our Result NuGet package. So yeah, we're going to have the invoice service as before. We're going to have the invoice entity, but we're going to have this invoice DTO as well. This could be implemented as a record type. Here we've got like a class, and we've got ID, amount, customer name. Suppose that, for example, the invoice has so many other properties, but for the DTO, we only want to expose these 3 properties. And then take a look here. The new map extension method extends the result type, allows to transform the invoice within a successful result invoice into an invoice DTO. And it will result in a result of invoice of DTO. Like it takes a function delegate of T and T result. T is the original value type, in our case invoice. Result or T result is the target value, invoice DTO, right? So this function is only executed if the source result is in a success state. This could be like a way to think about this extension method. As you can see here, it is called map. It is an extension method on this type, result of T, and it takes in the function, right? And of course, as you can see here, it's going to execute this function only when the status of our result is okay. And for the other cases, it's not going to happen. Now, what I want to do is to think about this scenario, go to my Visual Studio and try to implement this. Now, in our invoice service, suppose I add another method called getInvoiceById. It's going to say result of invoice, getInvoiceById, and it's going to taking the invoice ID, right? And then, for example, we can say if invoice ID is less than 0, we're going to return a result of invoice, and then we're going to pass in the identifier as the invoice ID, for example, and we're going to say the error message saying that invoice ID must be a positive integer, right? So that's it. That's one of the cases of this method, right? So then if invoice ID is not less than 0, we're going to get invoice from our database using the invoice ID. Do you remember we had this database, get database from invoice. And then we're going to say, you know what, if invoice equals null, then we're going to say return a result of invoice of not found. Otherwise, we're going to return a result of invoice dot success of invoice. So this is the way to implement this. If you take a look, we are going to get the invoice from the database. We're going to return an invoice, not an invoice DTO, right? So the next step is to implement our invoice DTO. So what I am going to do is to create a new folder here. I'm going to call it DTO, and I'm going to paste this here. I'm going to call it invoice DTO. Yes. I don't want a status. I don't want marketing campaign ID, only these two properties. What's the error here? It says the namespace already contains a definition for invoice DTO. Does it? No, I want this to be invoice. Okay. Now, invoice and invoice DTO. Now, what we want to do is that when we want to return the invoice from our controller, we do not want to return our entity. We want to return the DTO. So what I can do basically is very simple. I can go to the controller, right, and create a new invoice, a new endpoint. It's going to be an HTTP get, and it's going to taking the invoice ID like this, and then it's going to return an iAction result. It's going to be called get invoice and invoice ID, right? Invoice ID. Now, here inside of this method, we are going to say our result is going to be invoice service that get invoice by ID. We're going to pass in the ID of our invoice, but as I told you, we want to do the mapping here using that extension method I told you about. So we're going to say map, right? So we are going to map our invoice. This is a lambda expression like that function I told you about. It takes in the source type and the return type, something like what AutoMapper does for us, right? So invoice DTO, and then for invoice DTO, we can set the properties. For example, we can set the ID equals invoice, which is coming from our lambda expression. We can say the amount, invoice.amount. We can say the customer name. Customer name equals invoice.customer name. So we are doing the mapping, and then we are putting the result inside of this variable. Now, if you take a look at what Visual Studio has determined, is that right now the result is a result of invoice DTO. So if I comment out this mapping, if I comment out this, you see the result is not a result DTO, but I think it needs to get updated, because invoice service get invoiced by ID. Is it going to return an invoice DTO? It's going to return an invoice, not an invoice DTO. It's going to return an invoice. So we're gonna replace these guys with invoice, and then that renaming thing messed up so many things. So these are all the invoice, right? So it is saying that invoice DTO, I'm not gonna return an invoice DTO. I'm gonna return an invoice. Again, invoice DTO. Why does it think that I want to return an invoice DTO? Anyways, I'm gonna pause the video later and fix this. But for get invoice by ID, we're gonna return an invoice, not an invoice DTO, right? And then we are going to check this. We are going to fetch this from the database. This returns an invoice. I think that's the problem. And this will fix it, I guess. Yes. Yes. So from the get invoice by ID, we're going to return an invoice, result of invoice, not a result of invoice DTO. Now, if we go to our controller, this is an invoice, right? So if you take a look now, the result is a result of invoice. But if I do the mapping, the result will turn into a result of invoice DTO, right? And then of course I can return the result, right? So, and of course I either need to use this extension method or this attribute, because we are mapping from, if we want to use, let's do something. Let's go with this approach. I'm gonna return this, and I'm gonna return an result of invoice DTO. So right now we are doing two different things. One, something like the previous video, we are mapping from the result type coming from our service to the action result type we are returning to the user or client of this API. Another thing that we are doing is that we are mapping from our entity fetched from the database and coming from our service to a DTO. And of course, this mapping could also be done in different ways with something like AutoMapper, something that I intend to make a video about. But this is another possibility. This is a feature coming from our Dallas.result package. That's it for this video. I think I will create one last video about this our Dallas.result package, and then we're gonna wrap up this playlist. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking till the very end. I'll see you in the next video.